really glad that the Climate Emergency Garden is commemorating the E-Day this week, although a lot of the ceremonies are both solemn and rather nationalistic. My words are going to be partly borrowed from an editorial in the Morning Star last week, which I thought was quite good, but partly also from my memories of an international celebration of the E-Day 40 years ago in Bradford. And sadly it was the very same day of the Bradford City fire. But the Second World War was an internationalist war, undoubtedly, and the heroism of the armies that fought the murderous Nazi regime was equalled by the heroism of the partisans and the resistance fighters who fought and died across occupied Europe. That anti-fascist coalition gave birth to the United Nations, we know that. The fact that the UN has never truly been a summit of equals and that international law has so often been disregarded, it doesn't mean that these developments were not steps forward, one that millions of people at the time hoped would usher in a much more civilised world. For Britain's rulers, it might have been a war to preserve their empire. But for working class people, it was a war for freedom, the Second World War, for independence and increasingly for socialism. The years after the victory in Britain saw the establishment of a welfare state, the creation of the National Health Service, the nationalisation of the coal and the steel industries, and house building by government for those that needed it, all driven by a demand from below to plan for the benefit of all. However, liberation didn't extend to the British colonies then. That took decades more struggle, and British forces were dispatched to suppress liberation movements from Greece to Indonesia and across Africa. And the formation of the NATO military alliance put a clear end to cooperation with the Soviet Union and cemented the Cold War. In Bradford, in 1985, the Liberation Festival marked 40 years since the E-Day by celebrating the continuous determination of people in the UK and across the world to beat back racism and fascism. And I want to give a shout out to Roland Rance and Alex Hughes, who co-organised the Liberation Festival, and all those involved in it, including Colin Lloyd and Alan Richardson, who made this magnificent festival banner that's hanging here, 40 years old. The week of workshops and concerts was opened by Bradford's first Asian mayor, the progressive Mohammed Ajib. And we heard from George Johannes, the head of the African National Congress in Britain, still fighting then for liberation from apartheid in South Africa. We heard from poet Mel Collins, exiled from Grenada after the United States invasion of that Caribbean island. We heard from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, then as now, resisting the injustices inflicted by the Israeli settler regime and its UK government supporters. And we heard from the Britain-Cuba Resource Centre, but we also heard from anti-racist struggles in Britain and in Bradford, from Amrit Wilson, who was at the festival that day, from Jenny Woodward of the Drummond School Parents Action Committee, from Mandy Farah about racism and Bradford travellers. There was far too much in the programme to have a hope of mentioning it all. Many of the lines went forward during the festival, not least the community twinning project with Tisma, whose mayor-to-be was a guitarist for the visiting folk band from the Nicaragua Agricultural Workers Union. The Liberation Festival, I think, should encourage us to celebrate all the struggles of today, to celebrate every victory, however small, and to confront the crises of climate collapse, of war, the gross inequality, whose roots are the same today as they were 80 years ago. The competition for resources by private corporations and the governments that serve those interests rather than the people. So thanks to the City Climate Culture for its celebration of what we can and will achieve together. as opportunist ministers and racists now try to shut out refugees, we could remember the fates of the refugees from Nazism. The Britain and other countries' governments turned away before the Second World War, who died in the death camps. Our much honoured finest hour was when we fought against racism and fascism 80 years ago. And the heirs to that heroic generation of 1945 are all those who are still fighting racism and fascism and all injustice today. Thank you.